Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. I will readily admit that I had never heard of Enset before I encountered an article and research touting the crop's incredible potential to support food security. Enset is a relative of the banana. It has been cultivated in parts of Ethiopia for generations because it has several unique characteristics that make it a resilient and reliable staple crop. But beyond the Ethiopian Highlands, Enset is rarely, if ever, grown. As my guest, Dr. James Borrell, explains, this is due in part to history, geography, and culture. Dr. James Borrell is a research fellow at the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew in the United Kingdom. He is the co-author of a recent study demonstrating that Enset could be productively grown in other regions of Africa, potentially providing a staple crop for over 100 million people. We kick off the conversation with an extended introduction to this, quote, wonder crop, before discussing its potential to fight hunger and food insecurity in regions beyond the Ethiopian Highlands. This is a really interesting conversation. I love being introduced to research at the intersection of biology, conservation, and food insecurity and climate change. It really is at the intersection of so many different issues that are, I think, of relevance and important to so many listeners of this podcast. All right, now here is my conversation with Dr. James Borrell of the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew.
Everybody knows what a banana is. They eat the fruit, and they probably could recognize a tropical banana growing in a garden of a nice hotel in a tropical country. So we're all kind of familiar with bananas. The bananas, to give their technical term, the family is called the Musaceae. That's where the word musa comes from, and that's the sort of common name for banana in many countries. The Musaceae is quite a big family. There's about 70 or 80 species of banana. And then there's some sister groups. There's one called the Musella and there's one called the Ensets. And all of these plants are quite similar and we call them a family. And the species we're familiar with are the bananas that we eat. But there are other species in that family. And most of them are really poorly known and no one's ever heard of them. One of those species is called Enset. And whereas most bananas come from, or all true bananas come from Southeast Asia, Enset is actually an African species. And Enset's almost the complete opposite of banana in that bananas started in Southeast Asia and spread all around the world, whereas Enset is present across many countries in East and Southern Africa, but it's only ever been used in Ethiopia. So it has sort of an opposite distribution to what you'd sort of expect of most kind of domesticated plants.
What does it taste like? I mean, I take it does not taste like a banana.
No. So Enset's sort of, you have to throw away everything that you're sort of familiar with a crop. Okay. So we all have biases depending on where we come from or where we grew up. So I'm from the UK, which is a temperate region. So I'm very sort of familiar with cereals and tubers. And that's what I think of. But Enset, it's a giant herbaceous perennial. So it's like a giant banana. Its trunk can be a meter across. It has a corm underground that can weigh 100 kilograms. And that's that entire biomass, that entire sort of fleshy trunk that is pulverized. And then it's fermented for several months. That fermented sort of paste or sort of mulch is then baked into a type of flatbread. And you end up with a very filling, quite strong smelling starch staple, essentially.
Is it sort of like a blank canvas in terms of flavor? Like you could turn it into that bread, but add things on top of it?
Yeah, or you'd serve it with other things. So Enset forms part of a really important subsistence diet. And traditionally, it would be part of a diet with cabbage and milk. which might not sound that exciting, but that kind of covers all of your bases. If you are particularly affluent in Ethiopia, then you would eat Enset, and the food product made from Enset is called kocho. You would eat kocho with kitfo, and kitfo is raw minced meat. And that's the kind of sort of flagship regional dish. Like, that's really, really cool thing to eat. And I've tried it, and it is delicious. But Enset's, if you've not grown up with it, is always going to be a little bit of an unusual flavor, and it takes a bit of time to get used to. But it is a really filling crop, and that's a sort of perfect food for farmers and people who are really physically active.
And I take it, one thing that makes it particularly interesting from a food security perspective, that it is relatively easy to grow, or at least it's like a sturdy crop, and it can be drought resistant, much like, say, cassava.
Yeah, so this is essentially why we are really interested in Enset and why we're collaborating with our Ethiopian partners. So there are probably more than 7,000 or so crops that humans or plants that humans eat, and only a few hundred of those do we really consider crops. And of course, we could study and do modeling work and do genetic work on any of those species, and it would be really useful. But Enset fulfills a really unusual sort of niche. It has a really unusual combination of traits. And if you're interested in food security in developing countries, particularly under climate change, then Enset really ticks a lot of boxes. And the reason is severalfold. So firstly, Enset is perennial, and that means it continues growing each year. It's not sort of destructively harvested after one season. It also isn't seasonal in the timing that you can harvest it. So as Enset gets larger, you can cut it down and turn it into food at any point. It's not like a fruit tree, which is also perennial, but is only ready at a certain time of year. And what that means for farmers is that they have massive harvest flexibility. And that means that they can buffer seasonal food insecurity. So if you're growing Enset together with a suite of other crops, some of those will be ready at certain times of the year. Some of them might be cash crops, and they give you a return at certain times of the year. But if you have strange climate at a certain time of year, you have local issues, a family issue, or some other kind of disaster or disturbance, that can really throw that system, particularly if it's at a really important time of year when lots of your crops are ready to be harvested. So having Enset allows you to use it when it's needed. It's like an asset. We're calling it a green asset because you can dip into it when you need it. And so what you find on farms is that farmers have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old Ensets. They have all these different cohorts of different ages. And in a good year, they might use less and your stock kind of increases. And in a bad year, you use more and you dip into some of your younger plants you might not have planned to harvest. And that is buffering seasonal food insecurity over the years. I imagine most of your listeners, if they think about Ethiopia, where this is a staple crop, will have heard about Ethiopia because of famines and climate instability. And so it's probably one of the reasons why Ethiopian farmers have domesticated this crop over hundreds or thousands of years. We don't exactly know how long. It's to meet those challenges that the Ethiopian climate faces. And so those unique set of traits that Enset has make it this really unusual crop that we think could have wider utility, not just in Ethiopia, but perhaps more widely.
Unlike other subsistence farmers in other parts of Africa or other parts of the world, those who cultivate Enset are not as vulnerable. It's like the lean season, because as you said, it's perennial and there is no like lean season when you are cultivating Enset.
Essentially, yes. I mean, that's the hypothesis, and our research program is essentially trying to prove that, or test that, I should say. We come at it without with a hypothesis to test, but that's what our data seems to suggest. Yeah.
So if Enset has all of these really important qualities for food security, why hasn't its cultivation spread far beyond that one region of Ethiopia?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. So its distribution is amazingly narrow. And now Ethiopia is a very populous country. It's about 108 million people. And Enset is the staple for about 25% of that population. But if you look on a map, Enset hasn't spread out of that southwest corner of Ethiopia. And it's potentially been cultivated for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And so compared to lots of other global crops, and especially compared to banana, it's really closely related sister species that's now all around the tropics. Why hasn't Enset spread? Now, the work we've done recently shows that there is wider climate suitability elsewhere in Ethiopia and in other countries, particularly elsewhere in Enset's wild range. So probably one of the big reasons is that it's one thing having the plant, and it's another knowing how to cultivate it and turn it into food. And we call that sort of knowledge, we call that indigenous knowledge. So Enset cultivation and agronomy is really quite complicated. There's a complicated way of propagating it. There's a complicated series of steps to transplant it and grow it. The management is quite complicated. And then when you want to turn it into food, the fermentation process is quite complicated. Now, and Ethiopia is sometimes called the roof of Africa because it contains a very large proportion of the high elevation land in Africa, which means it has quite a different climate to elsewhere. And so the way farmers do crops, as well as the cultural and ethnic groups in Ethiopia, are quite distinct from neighboring regions in Sudan, Somalia, northern Kenya. And so it could be that sort of intervening region that is a lot hotter and drier acted as a barrier, not just to Enset's dispersal as a crop, but also, more importantly, to that indigenous knowledge. So the crop could move, but if you don't have that knowledge of the people that know how to grow it, then it's essentially useless to you. And so one hypothesis is that indigenous knowledge has provided the really big barrier. And that's really, really important because a lot of plant scientists, conservationists, we're focused on trying to conserve crops. One way to conserve crops is through gene banks and seed banks. And that's a really, really, growing strategy. But that can be, I won't use the word useless, but you can be really hindered if you conserve the crop, but you don't find a way to fairly and equitably conserve the knowledge that comes along with it. You're really missing out on 90% of its utility.
So that's fascinating. It's really that intersection of history and geography and culture that has potentially prevented the spread of Enset to other regions, to other parts of that region, I should say. Yeah. But your study looked at the potential geographic and climatic suitability of Enset to these surrounding regions and found that, in fact, Enset could survive and thrive theoretically, right?
Absolutely. And not just climatic suitability, identifying if it'll grow is one thing, but there's also, we tried to identify whether there are communities that could benefit from Enset's unique combination of traits, right? So Enset grows without irrigation, for example. And so if you have irrigation, then perhaps there's lots of other crops that are quite desirable. But if you're quite rural, you're predominantly subsistence, you're not particularly exposed to sort of the cash crop market, you don't have irrigation, you have the right climate. So a whole series of contexts, then yes, there's lots of actual places where Enset could really be suitable. But I should say that the really important aspect is that we, as a sort of collaboration between the UK and Ethiopian universities, are providing this knowledge and this research, but it's really a decision for the Ethiopian government and essentially the farmers who developed Enset to make that decision about what happens. And so I think there's two different kind of stages. There's one is exploring where else in Ethiopia. One thing that's really interesting is in very historic accounts of a couple of hundred years ago, there are descriptions of Enset from a much wider region in Ethiopia. And so there's some suggestion that that Enset underwent a big decline a few hundred years ago. So there's one stage is looking at its potential spread in Ethiopia to improve the food security of farmers outside of its current cultivation area. And then beyond that, there's the potential for other countries as well. But this is a sort of longer term view, but it's really exciting.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about what it would take to perhaps transmit or increase the adoption of Enset beyond the region in which it's currently cultivated. And you mentioned earlier, probably about 25 million people subsist off of Enset in part. Is that right, currently?
Yeah, so 25 million people are very substantially dependent on Enset. When we talk about expansion of Enset, we're not necessarily, advocating for, new people to treat Enset as their staple. What we're really excited about is the potential for Enset to help you buffer those extreme events, those disasters.
And in theory, based on your research, how expansive could those numbers be? How many people could be supported in part, could be prevented from falling deep into food insecurity through a more widespread use or adoption or cultivation of Enset?
So our modeling identified potentially a little over 100 million people across Eastern and Southern Africa, which fall in the sort of climatic envelope of Enset and meet a set of criteria. And the way I would, and of course I'm not an Enset farmer, but the way I would envisage the potential for that is farmers growing just a handful of Enset. New farmers growing a handful of Enset at the end of their farm. They require very little maintenance, but the statistic is one mature Enset plant could, The statistic is 15 mature Enset plants can feed a person for a year. And so just a handful of plants could get a family through, a several week period whilst other kind of interventions came online. So the potential for Enset is not necessarily to replace other staples, but it's to augment a different set of traits, and to be that buffer, that kind of emergency resource across a wider area.
So what then will it take for farmers in the wider region to potentially, use Enset as that buffer to prevent food insecurity, to prevent acute hunger?
I think it takes two things, and this is where the research kind of goes beyond us. The first thing I think it takes is for us to recognize much more widely internationally that crop diversity is one of the strongest tools we have to deliver climate resilience. Okay, so growing a diversity of crop that are ready at different times of year, that are reliant on different climate regimes, helps you buffer climate uncertainty. So crop diversity is absolutely key. If we can increase the sort of the knowledge and the acceptance and sort of the permeation of that approach, then I would really be looking to high biodiversity tropical countries, places like Ethiopia, other countries in West Africa, Uganda, Rwanda, to be the leaders, because these are the countries that are rich in crop diversity. It's their greatest asset. It's up to them in the future, I hope, because it will benefit all of us to lead the way in helping us increase the diversity of currently underused crops that the global food system relies on.
So it's like a political decision and political steps that need to be taken to
it's entirely political. To start with, this is a political approach. I mean, there's lots of fantastic sort of agricultural NGOs. If you gave them a challenge, can you get this crop to grow in this place and support people to use it, they would be able to do it. But the crops need to be fairly and equitably used. And this is the Enset is, for example, the heritage of Ethiopia. And so you can't, and it would be wrong to do anything that isn't led by Ethiopia, essentially, for Enset. And it's the same for many other crops around the world. So we need to have systems that fairly and equitably share the benefits of these crops.
So, mean, is it your perhaps belief that, if Enset is, equitably shared, if there are political steps taken to, introduce, cultivate, support farmers growing and cultivating Enset, that in fact, it can be like, I don't want to say a silver bullet, but a key tool to end acute hunger in that part of the world?
So one of the phrases that people really like to use is wondercrop. And, everyone loves to find one kind of simple solution that could have a really big impact. I think Enset does have a pretty unique set of traits, and I think it could fill a really important role. But there are hundreds, probably thousands of other remarkable species that haven't received anywhere near the research attention that they deserve. So to give you a statistic, we get more than half of our human calories from just 3 species of grass: rice, wheat, and maize. And so there's a spectacular diversity of plants that humans have used in the past. And the real silver bullet, I think, is maintaining the diversity of our agricultural systems and enhancing it, because there's a lot of evidence that globalization is contributing to sort of the homogenization of agricultural systems, which makes us all more vulnerable. So I would say Enset can be a really nice ambassador. It's an amazing crop. People can get really excited about it because it's like a banana, but not a banana, and it's kind of exotic and strange, and we've never heard about it. But it should be a gateway to getting people interested in crop diversity and why that's so important. And I should just say that I'm a conservation biologist by background, and I'm interested in wild biodiversity. I want to, conserve rainforests and all these things. But increasingly, we recognize that actually food security is the most important enabler of that. Very difficult to talk in developing countries about conservation unless you've met those basic needs of health, well-being, safety, security, and food security. And so agriculture and efficient agriculture and sustainable agriculture underpinned by agrobiodiversity is really key if we want to tackle climate change and tackle global biodiversity loss. It's the foundation of those things.
Well, I love your framing of Enset as the gateway to that larger conversation about crop diversity and biodiversity.
Enset isn't just one crop. There are actually hundreds and over 1,000 potentially different land races. And what I mean by land races is varieties. If you think about apples in a supermarket, they're all different varieties: Cox, Braeburn, Gala, Pink Lady. And a lot of these different varieties have different values to farmers. Some are drought tolerant, some are disease resistant, some mature fast, some are particularly tasty. And so we're really trying to help farmers adapt to climate change by tailoring which land races they grow and helping them adapt those land races as Ethiopia warms, like the rest of the world. And so using that diversity to help farmers adapt, I think is really, really exciting.
Well, James, thank you so much. This was really interesting. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Dr. James Borrell. That was fascinating. I knew nothing of Enset before I started the week, and now I know a whole lot more. All right. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.